You know, I went to the Dixon Street bookstore today, and I was browsing. Yeah, so I was browsing the shelves, and I saw my book there, and I wondered if I was honor bound to buy it. You know, anyway, I thought I should say, you know, so today is April 15th, right? And which is tax day. I hope everybody here knows. If any of you now leave, I know why you're leaving. And so I figure that maybe today is the one day of the year where people hate numbers the most, and then by proximity, maybe they hate mathematics more than ever. So I sort of hope that this lecture, which is sort of so far from that, and what I view as a surprising collection of applications of mathematics and quantitative analysis, you know, might, for those of you who maybe are still angry about your taxes, might sort of rejuvenate you and make you love mathematics again, and numbers in particular. All right, so this talk, the genesis of, well, or at least of my work in some ways on this kind of subject comes from the following. And this is a talk about the math of style and the math of visual style and all sorts of different artistic styles. So several years ago, a photographer artist named Alex Matter claimed that he had found a collection of Jackson Pollock paintings in a storage bin somewhere in Long Island. And you know, this generated a lot of excitement. If you say you've just found 32 drip paintings by Jackson Pollock and you own them, then you're sitting on $320 million of art, roughly. And also for art historical reasons, you know, this may cause people to reevaluate Pollock's work. But so when somebody makes an announcement like this, there's a lot of detective work that goes on, and a lot of what people call connoisseurship. You know, would Pollock have worked in this way? There's materials analysis. Was Pollock known to have used these sorts of media in his work at the time at which it was claimed these paintings were created? And then there's actually good old detective analysis, like who is this guy? You know, and why should he have 32 paintings? And it turned out that his family was very friendly with Pollock. Lots of pictures of the family picnicking together and so on and so forth. And so on the surface, it didn't seem totally crazy. But the people who finally rule on these things are, so in this case, it's the Pollock-Krasner Foundation. They're the ones who help create what's called the catalogue raisonné for the artist, all the works that are accepted, secure attributions by the artist. And the interesting thing about their sort of the people, the experts that they went to here, were that, well, as I said, there are all these things, was that at the end of, not at the end of the day, but somewhere in the middle, they actually turned to a mathematician, physicist, and asked his opinion. Now, you know, they didn't just ask his opinion as somebody who likes art, as Richard Taylor does, and who's somebody who's actually an artist, as Richard Taylor is, but they asked his opinion for an actual number, okay? So Taylor has a way to attach a statistic to Pollock work, and what Taylor decided, and he's looked at a lot of Pollock's in a quantitative way, was that the statistics didn't line up, all right? And that it was not likely, given what he knew from the works that we know were done by Pollock, that this could have been created by Pollock. And the incredible thing is that the Pollock-Krasner Foundation listens to him. Okay, I mean, they don't only listen to him. There were other reasons that they might not have accepted the work, but Taylor, who's a consultant to the foundation, was able to give them a mathematical reason. And in that sense, weighed in on the style of Jackson Pollock in a mathematical and quantitative way, which I think is sort of surprising, and a real sort of landmark moment in the admission, if you like, of mathematical or statistical techniques in looking at art and quantifying style. So it raises this question, you know, can Pollock's style be quantified? You know, can any artist's style be quantified? And that's what we're going to talk about. So let me take a step back and say a little bit about mathematics and the arts, okay? Because sort of the quantification of style is maybe the most surprising one. It's the most recent one. But there's a long history of ties or connections between mathematics and art. Now, I like to sort of break it down for reasons of alliteration, as you'll see. But so there's math is muse, so math is inspiration for art. So the Greek aesthetic of ratio and proportion, which we still see in all sorts of artistic creations today, including music. Various forms of symmetry. That's a very special kind of symmetry, an Escher circle created by hyperbolic symmetries of all things, but interesting geometry. Also, in less direct ways, many famous artistic movements, cubism, constructivism, abstract expressionism in some way, pop art, you'll see a sort of zeitgeist thing about the mathematics that was going on at that time and the kind of art that was being produced at that time. So there are interesting crossovers, which is a totally fun conversation to have. And also in some wacky ways, even in, I don't know why they decided that mathematics had something to say about underwear, but they did. So underwear inspired by mathematics. I'll leave you all to make your own jokes about that. So that's math as muse, and then there's math as maker. So for example, Escher knew a lot about hyperbolic geometry when he made many of his famous paintings, etchings, and drawings. The famous uses and discovery, if you like, of projective geometry in the creation of perspective in art. And of course today, with all sorts of digital constructions, which at the end of the day, and really at the end of the day, are all about pushing numbers around in a computer, that's math as a maker of art, math as an enabler, whether it's digital music or digital or film. One day there will be no actors and there will be no real scenery, and just mathematics on the screen. But what we've come up to is math as measure. Okay, and that's the question, and that's what I'd like to talk about. So I'm going to talk about it in a few different places, in literature, where it sort of came from, and as trying to answer the question is who wrote this using quantitative statistical methods. In the visual arts, so the question of who painted this, you can even ask analogous things with respect to movement, and so dance, for example, and music as well, trying to answer questions of compositional and musical style. All right, and then it goes on, and I'll just breeze through these at the end. There are just many ways. I mean, once you create this sort of framework of using statistical methods to try to extract style, you can then you can see it everywhere, if that's the lens that you want to look at things in. Okay. So literary style. So it traces its origins back about 150 years or so to Augustus de Morgan, of De Morgan's set theory. So De Morgan, in one of his letters to his wife as he was traveling around the countryside, he was thinking about this problem in particular, the problem of trying to distinguish between the various epistles of St. Paul and who the authors were. And he writes to his wife in this letter that if I just had, more or less, not in this language, but if I just had a little money to devote to this project, I'm sure that I could distinguish between the epistles of St. Paul by the average word length that the different authors use. So you just take all the words in there and you look at the average length of all the words, and that number should characterize the author. But that was as far as it went. He never actually did this project, and I always like to refer to this as one of the first instances where lack of funding stopped a good research idea. So however little however little the amount of money he would have needed to get some person to count those words. So then some 30 years later, so a physicist, American physicist, Thomas Mendenhall, basically took on the same sort of question, trying to understand, in this case it was the word length distribution, and we'll see a picture here, but again, so what fraction of words use one letter, what fraction of words use two letters, and so on in a given piece of writing by a particular person. That would be the word length distribution, and this was just an experiment, and so he took a collection of authors, Dickens, Thackeray, Stuart Mill, etc., and created these things which he called word spectra. And so here's the word spectrum for Oliver Twist. So this is just a count. So in 1,000 word blocks, each one of those curves is the histogram. So it's the number of words of length 1, the number of words of length 2, length 3, and so on. Is that okay? And so you see that they're, the curves are all roughly the same. And these are taken from, random, but anyway, different parts of Oliver Twist. Okay, so an interesting consistency. Now the fact is that, and I'll show you a picture later, we all generate curves that are roughly like this. Okay, I mean within some reasonable tolerance, and certainly not with enough variation to distinguish my writing from your writing, unless I was really trying. You know, but that said, you know, there's somebody, you know, working on what they think is an interesting experiment. So we'll continue. There must have been something in the air, and so some number of years later, Vincente Lutoslawski, who's a philosopher, so a historian of philosophy, so he was interested in the question of the chronology of Plato's dialogues. So Plato wrote a lot of dialogues. Does anybody know how many? I actually don't know off the top of my head. But he wrote a lot, and some of them we know when he wrote them, and others we don't know when he wrote them. And it's interesting when you try to understand the evolution of Plato's thought about different sorts of subjects to try to figure out, well, when were these dialogues written so I can trace how he was thinking of, you know, number, let's say, or how he was thinking of social contracts or something. And so Lutoslawski had this idea that he would just compute a whole bunch of statistics, sort of like word length or things like that. And basically, he'd create a graph, and he'd say, all right, I know this dialogue is written here at this time, so on and so forth, and here are the unknown ones. I'll compute those statistics for the ones I don't know and fit them in the best possible way, basically to make a smooth interpolation of the data points that I know, and that's when I'll assign a rough date to those works. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so again, and all of these things were, again, something about word counts or something about word pairs, but at any rate, some statistic related to number of words and different kinds of word usage. And Lutoslawski, I think he computed something like 800 statistics, in fact. And so he called this stylometry, so measure of style. And then the work continued. One particular example, which some people might know about, is the statistical attribution of the Federalist Papers, so a collection of essays that were published just before, during the time that there was a discussion of the ratification of the Constitution. There were 85 essays published, anonymously at first by Publius, but we all knew afterwards, because I guess all these guys wanted to get elected after there was a constitution, so they then stood up and said, I wrote those things. But John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, and so people were able to attribute most of them, but ultimately there were 12 that were unknown. There was an unknown attribution for 12 of the essays. And so Mosteller and Wallace, two statisticians, again, using something related to word frequencies, mathematically assigned all 12 unknowns to Madison using some technique called Bayesian inference. We don't have to go into that right now. And it agreed with expert opinion, more or less. And so the field really had legs. And now, where everything is digitized, and, you know, I mean, in the old days, you had to have some poor graduate student would count the words. You know, how many words were there of length 4? You know, go to your office and count those and come back in a week. And now there are so many pieces of software out there that you can use to do experiments like this. It's really, it's fun and lots of different techniques. And all sorts of applications, you know, from the sort of artistically or epistemologically interesting to the kind of nefarious ones of who wrote that email threatening so-and-so. But, you know, everything can be used for good or bad. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the techniques because it plays out a little bit later. And it's fun. So if you were going to use word frequency, there are sort of two ways in which you could try to use it, at least. So one thing you could say is that, well, the rare words, so the words that don't occur a lot, are the ones that characterize a person's writing style. So an example I always like to use is that when I was studying for SATs a million years ago, I learned two words that for some reason I've never been able to forget, avuncular and alacrity. Now, you don't hear these so much in common parlance. You know, somebody doesn't walk up to you and say, I've just met the most avuncular guy I've ever met. He's totally great. You know, or he arrived with alacrity is something you only read in sort of a 19th century novel. But, you know, I remember those. And so every once in a while I use them when I write. Okay? And So you might be reading some essay, some anonymously written essay or a letter to the Times, and you see those two words, and you say, I know who wrote that. It's Dan Rockmore, because he said that avuncular politician never arrives with alacrity. There's only one person who would have written that sentence. But when you think about it, the fact is that that's a lousy sort of discriminator, right? Because you could write that letter, okay? And then you could write some more embarrassing letter, and then they say, oh, Dan, I know you wrote that letter. I saw those two words in there. And so it's not what we would say robust, okay, in some fashion. So on the other end, but in fact, it is useful sometimes. So some of you may remember when Primary Colors came out. It was written anonymously, so to speak, but then people finally outed Joe Klein as the author. And it was done because they had sort of narrowed down the collection of authors it might be, and there were particular funny word usages that people knew Klein was very common, that he used commonly. And so finally they figured him out. So that was a rare word usage. But a more robust way to do it, and it turns out a pretty powerful way, is to look at common words, function words. So function words, for those of you who don't know, they're basically the lexical glue. They have no particular contextual or non-contextual meaning. So prepositions, conjunctions, pronouns, and so on. And so the way in which I like to think about, so this might be surprising, how often you use these kinds of words seems to be a fingerprint for your authorship. But if you've ever had the pleasure or disgrace of having your work copy edited, has anybody ever had that happen? So I'm sure many people in here have written books. Somebody copy edits your work, and basically their job is to find how far you are from Strunk and White and pull you back to Strunk and White. Okay, and Strunk and White is sort of the standard grammar textbook, or stylistic textbook. And so you see in the red lines and wacky circles and all sorts of things that copy editors use, all the times where you chose which and you should have chosen that, and you used however and you should have said nevertheless, and so you just see it there and you say, oh, that's how I write, and so it does turn out that these function words and their usage is a pretty good stylistic fingerprint. And I want to give you one fun example of the use of function words to perform an authorship test. So let me explain how it would go, and then I'll give you the example. So the way in which it would go is that, so you might have a book, okay, and so from that book you then take a list of numbers. So for every 1,000 words, what's the frequency on average that I use the word a? What's the frequency on average that I use the word as? What's the frequency on average that I use the word however, and so on? So that's the list of numbers that I'm going to attach to me in a piece of my writing. Does that make sense? So they're just fractions. How often do I use each of these function words? And that's just a list of numbers. Now, so that's a vector to a mathematician. And if I have 50 function words, for example, okay, that's a point in 50-dimensional space. Okay, we're not all going to try to imagine that now, but that's what it is. And so what I'm going to try to do then, if given a collection of books, okay, maybe I should go back a slide. So I could take a whole digitized collection of books, and every one of those books I now attach a list of 50 numbers to it. Is that okay? So the proportion of times I used a, as, and so on, okay, those 50 function words is now a list of 50 numbers. All right? So there are all these, I have all these points in 50-dimensional space. Mathematicians always go like this when they talk about high-dimensional space. It's like conjuring something up. But there are all these points out there, and I can't see them. There are about 3 mathematicians in the world who could see them in some way, I guess. I know one mathematician who claims he sees better in 4 dimensions than 3, and I almost believe him. So these are my books. Now, what would you believe if this was a reasonable signature? Then what would you believe about this collection of points in 50-dimensional space? Well, there should be neighborhoods, right? Sort of neighborhoods of one author. Like one author, if I digitized all of his or her books, got these lists of 50 numbers, those points should be close to one another, and so on and so forth, right? So, so that's sort of my cartoon, that maybe you would see a sort of breakup of space like this. Okay. So let me give you one working example of this. And this is work done by Jose Benongo in 2003. So Benongo took on the following problem. So there were 30 some odd Oz books. I can't remember, 32 or something. The Wizard of Oz was only one of a long series. And Frank Baum wrote all the initial ones, and then somewhere around the middle, in the fact that the 15th book, Baum died, okay, before the book was published. Now, no good publisher lets a series like that die, even though the authors died. That's just an inconvenience. And so they ask a lot of people, we want the next Frank Baum, we want somebody to continue the Oz series. And so Ruth Thompson won whatever kind of competition it was, and she took over and finished the 15th book in some measure, and then wrote the succeeding 16 books or so. But over time, sort of initially, the book was still by Baum. Nobody had heard of this woman, Ruth Thompson. Nobody's going to buy that 15th book by Ruth Thompson. They'll buy the book by Baum. But over time, she began to get more and more credit for it. And so the question arose, well, who wrote that book? Ruth Thompson died. She never claimed, she claimed to have written part of it. So could we actually figure that out mathematically or statistically? So we do the following experiment. We take all the books that we know Baum wrote, okay, in some 600,000 words. We take all the books that we know Thompson wrote, or a reasonable fraction of them. And again, these are all on, they're all online. You can download them all for free. From those, we extract the 50 most common function words that are used. All right, and then they're broken up into 5,000 word blocks for sort of correcting for context, if you like. And these feature vectors, remember, these are our vectors of length 50 that we constructed before, right? So how, in block I, okay, what was the fraction of times the word a was used? In block I, what was the fraction of time the word as was used, and so on and so forth. Is that okay? So every one of these 223 blocks, okay, has a point in 50-dimensional space. And so now, if in fact, so first of all, the first question is, going back to that cartoon, in 50-dimensional space, are there two blobs? Is there sort of a Baum blob, and is there a Thompson blob? Is this actually, a fingerprint for those authors, okay? So now, first of all, I should say, again, we can't see in 50 dimensions. So we have to do something called, we don't have to, but what Benongo did, and what one often does, is you do something called dimension reduction. You actually assume that those 50 dimensions, that there's a lot of redundancy in there. That maybe there's some combination of those numbers, okay, such that if I combine them all in the right way, maybe I'd only need 2 numbers or 3 numbers to still get a pretty good idea of what that blob looks like. Okay? So Benongo did something called principal components analysis, and the idea there is to find the best combinations of those statistics, okay, that still give you a good idea of what that blob was. And a reasonable metaphor for this is, if you're given some funny object, standard example is sort of a camel. Okay, so there's a camel, and somebody wants to shine a light to get a shadow of the camel to try to figure out if it's what is it? Is it a dromedary or a bacterian? I can't remember. There's one with 1 hump and one with 2 humps. Okay, when you have children, you'll learn what all these different animals are. So there are lots of ways you could get a shadow for a camel, right? You could shine the light directly on it, and then you just sort of see the profile, okay, on the back of the wall, all right? Or the most sensible way to shine a light on the camel is to shine it from the side, right? Because then I'm either going to see the 2 humps or I'm going to see the 1 hump, okay? So that's my best view of it. If I'm only going to allow myself one shadow, sort of a 2-dimensional picture, if you like, 2-dimensional summary of the shape of the camel. Okay, so again, you could shine the light in many ways, but it's the side view that's going to pull out the bumps. All right, so you do some kind of dimension reduction, and lo and behold, you actually do get sort of on one side Thompson's writings, and on the other side Baum's writings. Okay, so a 2-dimensional version of that 50-dimensional data gives you a pretty good division of the writing. And then you toss in the unknown book, okay, and lo and behold, all right, all the ones to the unknown book fall on Thompson, okay, which isn't so surprising. If somebody gives you a manuscript and you start you keep the story and you start editing it, you're going to, again, throw all your, I'm going to change that which to that and that however to nevertheless. That sounds right to me. Okay, so here's an example where you got a pretty good, you got good classification. All right, now I want to tell you, we'll get to the visual art soon, I promise, in a second. But I'm so excited by this work that I have to tell you this, because we only just did this like in the last month, and it's so much fun. We're just continuing to have fun with it. So there's something called Project Gutenberg. Does anybody know about Project Gutenberg online? Okay, so it's where all the old famous books go to die, or go to live, I guess I should say, right? So, 30,000 works in any famous, 19th century novel is there, and early 20th century, and some, lots of stuff that's out of copyright in particular. But this is a huge treasure trove, for stylometry, right? And so that cartoon that I put up in the beginning, you can actually try to make headway on that. Like, is there a geometry of literary space that makes sense? So with Nick Foti and James Hughes are two grad students who work with me in computer science. David Krakauer is my good buddy at the Santa Fe Institute. So we took on this problem. It's not very complicated. It takes a little bit of computing time, but not so complicated. And, right, so here's the first thing we did. So remember Mendenhall's word spectra. Okay, so first of all, I should say, we took only a subset of the works, authors who had at least 5 books in the database. Okay, so we wanted to make, and there are 5, so we wanted to make sure that they had a reasonable contribution. So here's what the word spectra look like. This is over about 800 authors, I think it is. And there are some funny outliers. It turns out that the outliers, like these people who use very long words, these are philosophy books. Okay, they are. It's true. It's true. It's interesting. Interesting. So that's just one statistic. But you see the regularity. Okay, and anyway, we can go into that. But that's one coarse scale look at it. Now what's the next thing we do? They're actually authors, those lines there, but it's not important what they are. We summarize, finally, every author by just one of these feature vectors of word usage. Okay, and then we basically, so those are 2 vectors. How many people here have taken like a linear algebra class? All right, some people, a lot of people, good. So basically, 2 of these authors are close to each other if the angle between their vectors is small. Okay, roughly after some correction. Okay, so this is the so-called correlation network of Gutenberg, and you see these 2 blobs. Now that's interesting. Okay, there's, well, what's going on there and what's going on there? That's structure. But it's too much to see. When my friend Mark Newman, who's maybe the best-known guy working on networks, would call this a ridiculogram. Okay, because it's just a picture. It doesn't mean anything yet. But we do see the beginnings of structure. So when you drill down a little bit, and I guess it's a little hard for you to see. Actually, I can't even see it from here. But that green one up there is Elizabeth Browning. And I think that Shakespeare is just underneath her. And I'm afraid I can't make these out. But it's so much fun to go browsing through this correlation network and see who's connected to whom. And so now, if we take that big blobby thing and now in some statistical way remove the quote-unquote unimportant edges, we begin to see more structure. Now, here is so that's Shakespeare, Dryden, Marlowe, I'm sorry, I can't remember, Ben Jonson, I can't remember who's over there. Those are 3 Civil War generals, all in a little neighborhood. I mean, I could go on and on. But the interesting thing about this picture is that each of these blobs, okay, and so the colored things actually have sort of temporal locality. Everything in those blobs, okay, they're close, statistically close. They're closer than other things, okay? So they're tightly tied. And what that speaks to is a notion of sort of literary evolution. When you write, you almost can't help yourself. When you write, you've been reading, and you unconsciously will echo the voices that you hear from other stuff that you've read. And people around a time read around a time, and they speak to each other. And there's it's all sort of proven, so to speak, or it's all statistically significant. Now, the next slide is my favorite one. So I wrote one book. You know, I want to know who my neighbors are. I mean, who wouldn't want to know who their neighbors are, right, in the Gutenberg network? And so I think my closest, so it's Ambrose Bierce and Herman Melville are sort of two of my close neighbors. And the other interesting thing is that there are even disciplinary clusters. Like there's an evolutionary cluster, there's a theologian philosophy cluster, and these people are reading each other. You know, I mean, there's a real coevolution in the way that thought and writing happen. But, you know, I wasn't so surprised to see myself there. My wife, who is a lawyer by training and teaches English composition now to freshmen at Dartmouth, she's always trying to make me write shorter sentences with, you know, and shorter words. Just say what it is you want. And I'm just like all over the place, you know. So I'm not at all surprised to find that I sort of write like some 19th century novelist. It's totally appropriate. Okay, and anyway, so this is work that's still going on, and I think it's so much fun. But anybody could do it. It's so much fun. All right, so now let me talk about mathematics and the visual arts. All right, so we did math as muse and maker, measure, right. So, sorry, but wait, sorry, this slide is out of order. Pretend I didn't say that. Let me say one other thing, which is a direct follow from what I said. So, there's a sense in which literature is the easiest thing to do, because we all, I mean, except for some discussion about various postmodern things, I think I at least believe that the word is the basic atom of writing, okay? And so, you know, doing statistics on words is probably the first thing you would think about doing if you were trying to understand writing style. Now, what else is kind of like words? Well, you know, music, okay, composition, all right? And so somebody has taken these kinds of literary stylometry ideas. There's a group around Robert Menares, who's at South Carolina, and looking at composers and the way in which they use different notes and different note collections and various compositional things, because there's some alphabet that you're working from to create a work of music. And I'm not going to go into it anymore, except to say that you can do a reasonable job just based on counts having to do with compositions to classify artists, to classify composers. All right, so now with that, so let me turn to visual stylometry, because here, you know, so this is a harder problem. It's a harder problem because it's not quite clear what's the atom, right, of a painting or a drawing. Okay, and that's an interesting discussion. But you might say, well, once I've digitized it, maybe it's the pixel. Okay, so now everybody has a digital camera. You probably know that it's a collection of red, green, and blue light intensities, okay, and those are then encoded in your computer as a collection of numbers. So if you just had a black and white digital camera, it would be encoded as some number between 0 and 255, let's say, and there'd be a grid of them. So a long list of numbers is a digital picture. Okay, is that all right? And so you might say, well, maybe the basic statistics of a digital picture, you know, are the things that I should be looking at. Well, so in some way, sorry about that. That was sort of what Richard Taylor did with Jackson Pollock's work. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but since I brought it up at the beginning, I have to at least deliver on it. So Taylor was sort of, Richard Taylor does everything having to do with fractals, and I'll talk about fractals more in a second, but he was sort of inclined to see in this picture something fractal-like. So what's fractal-like? Like something with sort of jaggedy edges, you know, a very jaggedy landscape, like a mountain landscape, okay, is a sort of fractal, is a fractal line, okay? Something that's highly textured, all right, is a fractal image. But sort of mathematically, how do we find fractal structure? So Taylor does the following thing, and I'll show it with this picture here. So Taylor computes something called a box counting statistic. So the idea is as follows. We have up there a spiral nebula, okay, which is one of the classic examples of a fractal object in nature. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything that I call the image, okay, and that's basically anything which isn't completely black, all right, and I'm going to start off, so the second box from the top there, you can see one of those squares there. That's my basic box size, Okay, and I'm going to see how many boxes do I need of that size to cover the image. Okay, and I'm just going to count that number. Okay, then I'm going to take a box size whose sides are half the size of that one, a square. I'm going to see how many of those box sizes do I need to count the image. Okay, and I keep decreasing the size of my basic box by a half every time. Is that all right? So those boxes add up to some area. Okay, and you can see that depending on sort of the size of my measuring stick, so to speak, if I use the box as my basic measure, the size of my measuring stick will give me, sort of a better and better approximation to the actual size of the image, right? Okay, so it's sort of like, how long is the coastline of England? Well, if I measure it with a ruler that's 1,000 miles long, it's one number. If I measure it with a ruler that's 6 inches long, it looks like another number. Okay, but there's some consistency in there. And what's consistent in there is this funny statistic, where in this case you take the log of 1 over the box size on this side, and you take the log of the number of boxes, and lo and behold, you get something like a straight line. Okay, and that straight line is the statistic, the so-called box counting exponent or fractal exponent. So Taylor does that with Pollock works. First he takes the painting, he finds layers in the painting. So layers, in this case, you basically take Photoshop and you put it on a pixel, okay, and then you say, I want all pixels that are roughly that color, okay, and then Photoshop pulls out the piece of the painting, the piece of the picture that's all roughly that color. And so Taylor computes these box counting statistics on different layers of Pollock work, of a given Pollock work, and it's this statistic that he says is characteristic of Pollock's working style in different times. Okay, and so what happened with those matter paintings is that they didn't fall in the right tolerance, if you like, according to Richard's analysis. And and there are lots of arguments about whether or not it makes sense, but that's what happened there. And this just tells you that story. So Richard's done this on the entire Pollock canon and has a whole bag of statistics, which he doesn't exactly tell anybody what it is he does for fear that somebody will try to randomly create a Pollock in this way. Okay, so that's another discussion. But that is just based on pixel intensity. Okay, so very sort of coarse statistic. And even if you don't believe him, it is kind of interesting that an artist could work that consistently over a time period. Okay, and so if style is just sort of the artist saying, I'm happy, after working in some way, then over different times in Pollock's life, he's working in different ways and sort of saying at roughly the same time, so to speak, and working on a piece of art that I'm done, right? And that's part of it. That's part of what this is getting at. So I want to get to other stuff, so I'll just breeze through this quickly. There are other simple statistics that I've looked at with Dan Graham, who's a postdoc who's worked with me the last 2 years, who's great, and James Hughes again, who's also worked on this Gutenberg thing. Something called the amplitude spectrum of the discrete Fourier transform of in this case, Picasso's work. Turns out to be a not bad characterization of different styles, because the amplitude spectrum actually is something about spatial organization of an image. But again, a single statistic roughly related to pixel intensity. And just as an aside, an interesting thing is that, so I'm not an expert in Picasso or Braque, and if you showed me these two, I couldn't tell you at all who did either of them, but this simple statistic actually discriminates pretty well between Picasso and Braque in their early Cubist work, which surprised my friends of mine at the New York Museum of Modern Art. So there are interesting things that you can get from simple statistics. Now, but that said, it's a really coarse way of looking at things. So I want to talk about some more detailed work that I've been doing and others are doing in this field of what I would call visual stylometry. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of what people call scientific connoisseurship, because this is in some way, I think, the natural child or the natural sort of modern version of scientific connoisseurship. So Giovanni Morelli he was a total polymath. He was Italian, or I guess maybe Italy didn't exist as a country at that time, but he was Italian. I'm not quite sure of the region. But he was a doctor. He was a paleontologist. He was a student of Louis Agassiz, who's one of the most famous paleontologists ever. But later in life, he sort of became a statesman. And one of the things that he was very, very that was of great concern to him was the world of art, and in particular the art created by his countrymen. So Botticelli was from his area. And what he was very worried about was that people were passing off as Botticelli's things that weren't by Botticelli. People were passing off by Bellini things that weren't by Bellini. And so Morelli had this idea, which isn't so, when you think about it, he was a paleontologist in his early life, and what do paleontologists do? They have a million examples of thigh bones, right? And then somebody gives them a bone. They say, well, what is this? And they say, well, I don't know, but it's not a thigh bone. You know, I have 20 thigh bones here. It's not one of those, okay? So Morelli took this kind of attitude toward authenticating art. So he drew up, I think he drew them, things that he called schedules, okay? So he drew up details in works of art, for example, done by, I think this one is Bellini. So he'd create for himself a collection of Bellini ears. He'd sketch them. This is, an ear from this painting, from this drawing, from this painting. And somebody would say, I have a Bellini. And he'd walk up and say, well, I got my list of Bellini ears. Let me go look at the ear in this painting. And he'd go and look and he'd say, I don't think that's a Bellini. Look at that ear. It's not one of these. It doesn't look like that. So he was doing by eye. I mean, he's doing some statistical test. But is this consistent with this training set, basically? Here's his training set of ears. Give him a new ear and say, I just don't see it there. It's not like that. It's got jaggedy things with hair in them. It's not a Bellini ear. So the goal, can we make math out of Morelli? Because again, it's saying it's not like them is really saying it's not consistent with this training set. And so if I can sort of create a mathematics that reflects the geometry and get a statistic for those things and, then ask, well, is that thing statistically likely to have that number? Okay, then I could at least make a ruling on that. You don't have to believe me, but I can just tell you relative to the world of known Bellini ears, that thing is not a Bellini ear. So one way in which I did this with some colleagues some years ago, so we took a look at drawings done by Peter Bruegel, the elder, famous Flemish artist, and it was that kind. And sort of the story I'm telling you about Morelli was that kind of story. A friend of mine was the curator of a big Bruegel show that was at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art in the fall of 2001. And so I got the opportunity to walk around the show with her telling me about it on a day when the museum was closed. And so she told me this long story about how in 1900 there were 100 known or authentic, in 1900, 100 authentic Bruegel drawings. In the year 2000 there were 50. What happened in those 50 years, So lots of things happen, okay? Sometimes people, find, due to technology, sometimes people find that the materials are different, okay? Sometimes people find that a signature that they didn't see before. All sorts of things happen. Other times, to be perfectly honest, somebody's been thinking about a drawing for 20 years and wakes up one day and says, you know what? I've been bugged by that drawing for 20 years, and today I'm going to declare it's not a Bruegel, and I know why, okay? So Nadine Orenstein was the curator, and she was telling me about the trees, that a characteristic thing, these are like the Bellini ears, so, that there are these kind of threes. You see these threes everywhere? If you look, they kind of look like threes everywhere in the leaf work. And so she's telling me this thing, and I'm thinking, well, I bet you the computer could do that, okay? Maybe, We know lots of computational techniques for characterizing curves and lines, okay? So maybe the computer could do that kind of thing. So she got us some slides. She indulged me. She thought it was totally crazy. And not so interesting, so we digitized them, et cetera, et cetera. And then we did a particular kind of thing. Now remember, there's a question of what's the fundamental atom to look at? What's the thing to build your statistics on? Well, here it's not the pixel. I want to try to get at something about the lines and the curves. Okay, so there's a mathematical technique or a mathematical analytic tool called Wavelets, and we applied Wavelets. Now, Wavelets can be a little complicated, but one way that I like to describe them is sort of by Etch-a-Sketch. Now, I don't know, does anybody still use an Etch-a-Sketch? Has everybody in here used, do you know what an Etch-a-Sketch is? So it's this, so there are these knobs there, okay? The white ones are the knobs on a real Etch-a-Sketch, okay? And you can move this little cursor. The left one maybe is vertically, and the right one is horizontally, okay? And it sort of plows through the screen and it outlines something. And if you search on the web under Etch-a-Sketch portraits, you will see the most incredible things. There are these incredible portraits of Andy Warhol in Etch-a-Sketch. But so basically what Wavelets try to extract is take a small patch of the drawing, okay, and ask, on average, roughly, how much did I move the up-down knob, okay, on average in that patch? Okay, and on average, how much did I move the horizontal knob, okay, in that patch? And then we throw in a third one, which is as if I could move the cursor diagonally, directly. Okay, so it's getting some average linear composition over a small patch. Okay, and there's some number attached to that. In that case, there are 3 numbers. So I don't want to go into too much detail. And this is, this extracts the horizontal stuff. This is, no, yeah, that's the wrong one. It's the other way around. It should be diagonal and vertical. But you get those pieces of information out for every patch, and you get a long list of numbers. Okay, and in this case, it was I'll just go back. We get a 72-dimensional summary for every little patch in the painting, in the drawing. Okay, and then we get a bunch of points in space. So this is just like the literary example, right? And so now my question is, I have a whole bunch of drawings. Okay, so I have ones that I know were done by Bruegel, and the guys in red are now believed to have not been done by Bruegel. Okay, and now I do some kind of dimension reduction. I reduce those globs of 72-dimensional points actually to one point in 3-dimensional space. And here's what we get. We actually get a cluster of Bruegels in the middle, and the non-Bruegels are outside, according to current attribution. Okay, so that was pretty surprising. I think, an interesting proof of concept, for the idea that mathematics could weigh in on drawings, okay, on visual art in that fashion. I then did some further work to actually do with my friend Greg LeBone on some real statistical measures, and that work stands up statistically. All right, I don't want to keep people here. All right, I've got 10 minutes, I guess. So let me tell you about some further work. Okay, so with that kind of work and then other work, I don't know why there's oh, sorry. Whoops. Okay. There were various other efforts to do that kind of work in paintings. Okay, and in particular, there was a project called the Van Gogh Project, run under the auspices of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and the question was, could you characterize Van Gogh using mathematical tools? And there were a lot of different working groups attached to it, and the Van Gogh Museum was very generous with access and so on. Actually, I wasn't part of this. These are other groups. And so an interesting thing that they did in the first Van Gogh project was the following. So they ran a contest, and they ran the following kind of contest. And it was really because Nova wanted to have an exciting show about art authentication and mathematics. It's an interesting thing about the media. When we did the Bruegel thing, and I'll come back to the picture that's on the poster. When we did the Bruegel thing, I thought the most interesting thing we did was the drawings work, okay, because it confirmed opinion, all right, and that seemed amazing to me. But what the media wanted was they wanted controversy. So if we agreed with everyone, there was no controversy. That's not interesting. Tell us about the painting, which is what's in the poster. So similarly, when I was called by Nova about this Van Gogh project, and I explained, well, they're trying to characterize this. They said, well, have they found any fakes? Have they found fakes? We need fakes. I don't know if there are any fakes. Now, so they weren't going to talk about new fakes. You know, museums don't want you to report a new fake. But so what they decided to do was the following thing. They would take 5 secure ones, and then they would have one of the conservators at the Van Gogh Museum would create a fake Van Gogh. Okay, so if you're going to have a fake Van Gogh, you want to control it. You want to know who made it. Okay, you want to have your hands on it, and then you want to tear it up after it's done. And the question was, could you mathematically pick out the fake Van Gogh? And so there were several teams on it using different kinds of, there's a nice article on it in IEEE Signal Processing Magazine. And all the working groups were able to actually pull out the fake using the training material from the museum. Okay, and then there was a second Van Gogh project, and there are more questions that people are asking about, you know, dating, a la like the Ludoslavsky problem with Platos Dialogues. Attribution is always the million-dollar question, and other sorts of characteristics that you'd like to distinguish. And there are other techniques that I won't go into that I continue to work on with various friends of mine. But it doesn't always work, okay? Which doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that there's a lot to learn. Now, one example where it didn't work, after I did the Bruegel work, the Metropolitan Museum said that they let one of their photographers work with me for a day, photograph all their Rembrandt portraits. Okay, beautiful, you know, beautiful whatever. At that point, it was like a 20-megapixel camera, big portrait camera, and because there's a long-standing question in art historical circles about the attribution of the Rembrandt portraits. Okay, it's an open question. You know, nobody argues. I mean, nobody argues that there isn't a question to ask as to which ones were really by Rembrandt. And the fact is that just doing the sort of dumb thing of using a tool that we had developed for drawings, and drawings are very different from paintings. So drawings, I believe that drawings are really two-dimensional things, you know, and they're really an accumulation of line. And the line is the basic element of a drawing. Now, paintings are really three-dimensional. I'm sure if there's an art historian in here, they'll agree with that. There's a real topography to them, and people have used that actually to characterize different aspects of artwork. And so this artist, because I didn't know anything, you know, just shoot them, you know. And so the artist puts them there, shoots them in this great flat light, and they come out looking beautiful, but you can't see any brushstroke work. They're just beautiful, flat, glistening paintings. You know, there's no topography to them. So, you know, paintings are much more complicated than drawings. So, which brings me to this one. Now, you see, this is the one that the media wanted to report, because here was one where so this is an altarpiece that's owned by Dartmouth and attributed generally to Perugino, okay, famous Renaissance artist. But artists in those days generally worked in these big workshops, and you had lots of people working on your painting. You know, the primary artist to whom you would attribute the work he's the person, it was almost always a he, is the one who would sort of get the painting as part of his CV, okay, and everybody else you'd never hear about them. But, you know, probably his, you know, apprentices did the feet, you know, or the, you know, whatever, you sort of let your worst graduate student do the stick or something, right? But so it's known, you know, many hands, okay? And that was a question, how many hands worked on this painting, okay? And I'm not an art historian, and none of the three of us were art historians, you know, computer scientists, mathematicians. And so what do? We say, all right, well, I don't know, we'll crop the faces, okay, and we'll do our statistical analysis on the same feature vectors. For a black and white, we actually grayscale the picture for a black and white version of the painting. Okay, and so that's what we do. And then we get this picture here that you see in the poster, right? And we get 3 dots close together over here, and 1 dot over there, and 1 dot over there, and 1 dot over there, and then the media says 4 hands. Okay, and it's interesting because what is now believed is that while this may be attributed to Perugino had a very famous student named Raphael, who you may have heard of. And so Larry Cantor at Yale thinks that actually this may be by Raphael. Now, if it's made by Raphael and not Perugino, it's worth like an order of magnitude more than it was. And so now, well, wait, so did Raphael do 3 of them and the other guys did 1 each or something? Now, you see, you've got to be asking yourself a question now. I've got 6 points, and I have to say, this is the one they report on. You know, I've got 6 points here, okay? So some basic combinatorics. I had 6 points. If you randomly chose 6 points and partitioned them into subsets, okay, the least likely thing would either be all of them together or all of them apart, okay? But to have some division like this, just at random, actually isn't so unlikely. I mean, the numbers had to come out some way, right? So that's the way they came out. But now, the way in which the great ending to this story is that I gave this talk, or I gave not this talk, but a talk about this piece of art at the Clark Art Institute outside of Williams College. Okay, so very well-known art institute with a great conservation lab. So I'm giving this talk, and everybody's very nice to me. I don't know anything about art. I'm just a mathematician. And so at the end of the talk, somebody comes up to me, and they say, "I know who one of the hands is." I say, "All right, who's one of the hands?" He said, "I am." I said, "What do you mean you are?" He said, "Because 20 years ago, Dartmouth sent that painting down to the Clark Art Institute and asked me to restore the face of Madonna." Okay? So that brushstroke work that you see on the nose of the Madonna, that's my hand. So you see, you really, and this is just, when you're doing applied math or applied statistics or any sort of applied scientific work out of your usual domain, you know, you really have to ask people, like, well, what do you guys do? What do you know? Like, what's the thing for me to look at? You know, you can't just blunder in like an idiot and say, "I know what you're doing. I'm going to send it through the computer. You guys are nuts." You know, you can't do that. You've got to, you really have to be sensible about it. And so this work, I mean, paintings are difficult, and I didn't appreciate that to the extent I appreciate it now. So, which isn't to say it doesn't make a great poster. All right, so other things that we're doing with the Museum of Modern, this is the Metropolitan Museum. There's an interesting, I'll just go to this, interesting question of, is Velázquez really the guy in there? Okay, now that's an interesting art historical question because, you know, if it is, and then there are all sorts of things you take away from that. What's he looking at? You know, who, you know, all sorts of things. There are all sorts of things that you read into the context of his inclusion or his exclusion from the painting. But the problem of face recognition in paintings is actually a complicated one. So there are interesting computational problems all over this field. Now, all right, I've got, if you can bear with me for 2 more minutes, I'm just going to go to this picture here. This was for Luca, I have to say. So Luca was very interested in music style and music attribution. So I'm going to tell you one story here, done by other people, mainly, let me get his name right. Oh no, wait, is it on this? Maybe it's on this one. Yeah, Craig Sapp. And so the problem, so to speak, was the following. So Chopin is known for creation of a lot of musical pieces called mazurkas, okay? And in 2006, I believe it was, a well-known pianist, Joyce Hatto, who was suffering from cancer, released a whole new, according to everybody, released a new collection of recordings of Chopin's mazurkas. Somebody was listening to these mazurkas and said, "I think I've heard that before." Not by Joyce Hatto. And so doing something very simple, actually discovered a real similarity to some earlier recording of mazurkas. And so Craig Sapp and others took on the problem of trying to distinguish, well, did Hatto make these recordings or not? And so this picture here, so let me try to explain. This picture here is some comparison of Artur Rubinstein's playing of one particular mazurka as compared to a whole collection of recordings of mazurkas. And basically what this is, at each line, there's every pianist in the sort of treasury is encoded by a given color, and every dot in there is the most similar playing of a particular part of that piece to whoever's in the corpus, okay, of Rubinstein's work. So this is what you would expect for sort of a random thing. You know, no similarity up top and then maybe some similar phrasing. This is actually just the beat structure, the phrasing, because the music's the same for everybody. It's the way you phrase it. So you expect this sort of heterogeneity. When you take Hatto's recording, you get one person, generally. And this was true for all these recordings. And then that's the style of a pianist, okay? Everybody's working from the same music, but the way in which you, if you like, spread out the time, okay, is how things might differ. And so and her husband owned up to it. You know, Hatta was nearing the end of her life. She had done a collection of recordings. He didn't think that they were so great. He then took some recordings that were made in 1938 and he re-released them, okay, under her name. But the interesting thing is that the statistics, the mathematics, I found it. So, all right, I'm just going to breeze through to the end. There are, so that's the majority of it. There are ways in which you can quantify the way in which we move. That's what motion capture does, which, as many of you know, is the way in which you create digital actors. You have a sort of exemplar, which is this person here, and you see how when they walk, the ways in which these dots, which articulate your sort of anatomy, your structure, okay, move in time, and that gives you a way to then give movement to a collection of digital actors. A sort of fun application is you can take this person and then make these things, these animated, these digital creatures move like this person. You could do that with a dog. You can even do it, if you know like how Baloo the bear moves, you could then try to make Fred Flintstone move like Baloo the bear. You can do motion capture on cartoons, which I think is totally great. So this is sort of artistic style, but there are so many kinds of style. There's your personal style, right? 29 dimensions. Well, you answer a bunch of questions. They put you in 29-dimensional space, and then they say, look, you've got all these neighbors here. Go out with them. Okay, one of them will work. All right, or one of them won't work. It's not clear. At the end of the day, I met my wife at random, but then it turned out that our parents have known each other for 50 years, so who knows. So you have a shopping style, and that's how Amazon tells you to buy stuff after you've bought stuff. Fraud detection, you're buying stuff that you don't usually buy. I was stopped once in Roswell, New Mexico, buying digital cameras. They couldn't believe I would be in Roswell, New Mexico, but I was. There's so-called technical analysis in the market, so people believe that patterns, that different sort of equities have style. And again, you can see that, style, statistical classification, whatever you want to call it, but that has allowed us, we've done some interesting work trying to understand the style of the markets. That's some networked version of the New York Stock Exchange that I did with my colleagues at Dartmouth. This is the style of Moody's, of the way in which they rated mortgage-backed securities. Okay, this is a dimension reduction of what were originally 135 dimensional vectors summarizing different mortgage-backed securities, and they're coded by their rating. And what we did with that was we then predicted rating movements based on, again, style, so to speak. I don't know, and that's kind of it. So maybe just to say, we certainly are in part our numbers. In a digital world, everything, if it sits on the computer, it's a perfectly sensible question to ask. Well, to what degree is there consistency in those numbers that you've generated, whether it's by drawing or shopping or dating, whatever it is. The fun thing about it is that if you're so inclined, and I am, and maybe some of you are, you can use that to investigate all sorts of areas that you just like for fun. That's what tenure is for, anyway. Anyway, thanks for your attention, and I thank you for inviting me.